Blake Blackwell had always prided himself on reading people. 15 years as a cognitive behavioral therapist had taught him to spot the microscopic tells that betrayed hidden trauma, buried rage, festering guilt. He could watch someone's hands during an intake session and know within minutes whether they'd been abused, whether they were lying, whether they were dangerous. It was a gift that had saved lives, marriages, futures. But he'd been blind to what was happening in his own home. The Tuesday morning started like any other. Sophie, his 8-year-old daughter, sat at the kitchen table pushing scrambled eggs around her plate. Her honey blonde hair hung in her face, unwashed for the third day in a row. Blake had noticed, but chalked it up to a phase. Kids went through phases. "You feeling okay, sweetheart?" he asked, crouching beside her chair. "You've barely eaten." Sophie's green eyes, his eyes, flickered toward him briefly before dropping back to her plate. "Just not hungry, Daddy. You need energy for school. Big math test today, remember?" A tremor passed through her small frame, almost imperceptible. But Blake caught it. "I don't feel good," Sophie whispered. "Can I stay home?" This was the 4th time in 2 weeks she'd asked. Blake pressed the back of his hand to her forehead. "Cool skin, no fever." "What doesn't feel good?" "My stomach." Christina emerged from the bedroom, her auburn hair pulled into a severe bun, makeup perfect despite the early hour. His wife had always been beautiful in that sharp, untouchable way, all edges and angles. Lately, those edges seemed sharper. "Blake, you're going to be late for your first appointment," she said, not looking at Sophie. "I'll take her to school. She says her stomach hurts." "She's fine." Christina's tone left no room for discussion. "Sophie, go brush your teeth. Now." Sophie flinched at the word now and scrambled from her chair. Blake watched her disappear down the hallway, something cold settling in his chest. "She's been complaining a lot lately," he said carefully. "Maybe we should take her to the doctor. It's anxiety about school. She needs to push through it." Christina poured coffee with mechanical precision. "My mother agrees. In fact, she offered to take Sophie this morning so I can get to my conference call on time." Blake's mother-in-law, Delia Daniels, had been a fixture in their lives since the beginning. A former elementary school principal with opinions on everything, she'd moved to their neighborhood 3 years ago to be close to family. Christina claimed it was helpful. Blake found it suffocating. "Your mother's taking her to school, unless you want to cancel your 8 o'clock?" Blake glanced at his watch. His first client was a teenage girl with severe PTSD from childhood sexual abuse. She tried to kill herself twice. He couldn't cancel. "Fine," he said, "but I want to take Sophie to Dr. Morrison this week. Get her checked out." Christina's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "If you think it's necessary." 20 minutes later, Blake kissed Sophie goodbye on the front porch. She clung to him longer than usual, her thin arms wrapped tight around his waist. "Love you, Daddy," she whispered into his shirt. "Love you more, baby girl. Have a great day at school." He felt her grip tighten before she released him. When he looked back from his car, she was standing on the porch alone, small and still, watching him leave. Blake's office was downtown, a 40-minute drive through rush hour traffic. He spent the time mentally preparing for his day. 2 PTSD cases, 1 couples counseling session, and an emergency intake for a new client showing signs of severe depression. His practice specialized in trauma recovery, and business was unfortunately booming. The session with his first client, Emma, went well. She was making real progress, starting to reclaim pieces of herself she'd thought were lost forever. These were the moments Blake lived for, watching someone emerge from darkness into light. He was reviewing notes between appointments when his phone buzzed. A text from Christina, running late. "Mother's picking Sophie up from school." Blake frowned. School didn't end for 6 more hours. He started to text back, then stopped. Christina was probably just planning ahead. But something nagged at him. He opened the family tracking app they'd installed last year after Sophie got lost at the mall. The blue dot representing his daughter's phone sat motionless at 1247 Maple Street, Delia's house. Blake's fingers tightened on his phone. School was at 892 Oak Avenue, 3 miles in the opposite direction. He checked the time, 10:47 a.m. Sophie should be in math class. He tried calling Christina. Voicemail. He called again. Voicemail. The cold feeling in his chest spread to his limbs. Blake stood, walked to his assistant's desk. "Judith, cancel my 11 o'clock. Family emergency." He was in his car before she could respond. The drive to Delia's house took 18 minutes. Blake's mind raced through possibilities, each more unsettling than the last. Maybe Sophie really was sick and Delia had picked her up early. Maybe it was a school holiday he'd forgotten about. Maybe the tracking app was glitching. Maybe. But Blake had spent his career learning to trust his instincts about hidden dangers, and every instinct was screaming that something was profoundly wrong. Delia lived in a modest craftsman bungalow with a manicured lawn and flower beds that looked magazine perfect. Blake had always found the house unsettling in its sterility, like a museum where nothing could be touched or disturbed. He parked across the street and sat for a moment, watching. The curtains in the front window were partially open. Through the gap, he could see movement. Blake got out of the car slowly, quietly. He crossed the street and stepped onto the lawn, approaching the window at an angle. The movement inside resolved into shapes. Figures. What he saw through that gap in the curtains would be seared into his memory forever. Sophie was on her knees in the center of the living room, still wearing her school clothes. Her face was red and tear-streaked, eyes swollen from crying. She was looking up at someone out of Blake's line of sight, her small hands clasped in front of her chest, begging. Blake's heart stopped. Then Delia stepped into view. His mother-in-law stood over Sophie with something in her hand, a wooden ruler thick and heavy. Her face was twisted with disgust as she looked down at the child. She was speaking, though Blake couldn't hear the words through the glass. Sophie's mouth moved. "Please. I'm sorry, please." Delia raised the ruler. Blake didn't remember moving, didn't remember crossing the porch or trying the door. One moment he was at the window, the next his shoulder was hitting the door, the frame splintering as the lock gave way. The scene in the living room froze. Delia spun toward him, ruler still raised. Sophie's head turned, her face transforming from abject terror to desperate hope. "Daddy!" Blake crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to his knees. Sophie collapsed into his arms, sobbing so hard her entire body shook. He wrapped himself around her, shielding her, and looked up at Delia over his daughter's head. His mother-in-law's expression shifted through several emotions in rapid succession. Shock, fear, anger, and finally settling into something cold and calculating. "Blake," she said, lowering the ruler with deliberate slowness. "I can explain." "Don't." His voice came out deadly quiet. "Don't say a fucking word." Sophie's sobs intensified. Blake felt her tiny fingers clutching his shirt, bunching the fabric in desperate fists. She was shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. Sophie wasn't feeling well. Delia continued as if he hadn't spoken, her tone shifting to something maternal and concerned. "I pick her up from school. She was being disrespectful, and I said don't speak." Blake carefully extracted himself from Sophie's grip, keeping his body between her and Delia. "Sophie, baby, look at me." His daughter's tear-stained face turned up to him. In her eyes, he saw something that made his blood run cold. Not surprise at his arrival, but relief. Not shock, but validation. "How many times?" he asked softly. Sophie's lip trembled. "Every time you leave for work, Daddy." Her voice was barely a whisper. "Every single time." The room tilted. Blake's vision tunneled. Every time. Every morning he'd kissed her goodbye and driven away. She'd been delivered into the hands of her abuser. "She's exaggerating," Delia said sharply. "Children have such active imaginations." "Show me," Blake said to Sophie, still not looking at Delia. With shaking hands, Sophie pushed up the sleeve of her shirt. Bruises mottled her upper arm in distinctive parallel lines, the width of a ruler. Some were yellow-green, days old. Others were purple-black, fresh. Blake's world collapsed into crystal clarity. This wasn't a single incident. This was systematic, prolonged. This was torture. He stood slowly, positioning himself fully in front of Sophie. When he finally looked at Delia, his expression must have frightened her, because she took a step back. "I want you to listen very carefully," Blake said, his voice stripped of all emotion. "You're going to put down that ruler. You're going to sit in that chair. and you're going to stay there until the police arrive. If you move, if you speak, if you so much as breathe loudly, I will forget every principle I've built my life on and I will hurt you. Do you understand?" Delia's face flushed red. "How dare you threaten me in my own home? I am your wife's mother." Blake pulled out his phone and dialed 911. As it rang, he kept his eyes locked on Delia. "Yes, I need to report child abuse. 1247 Maple Street. The abuser is still on scene. My daughter has been beaten repeatedly." He paused, listening. "Yes, I'm her father. I just discovered her here when she should be at school." Delia's face went from red to white. The ruler slipped from her fingers and clattered to the floor. "They're sending a car now," Blake said, ending the call. "Sit down." This time, Delia obeyed. Blake crouched back down to Sophie, who was crying silently now, tears streaming down her cheeks, but making no sound. That silence was somehow worse than the sobbing. "It's okay, sweetheart," he whispered, pulling her close again. "I've got you. Nobody's going to hurt you ever again. I promise." "She said you'd never believe me," Sophie choked out. "She said nobody would believe a little girl over a grown-up." "What else did she say?" Sophie's whole body trembled. "That if I told, she'd make sure I never saw you again. That mommy would send me away to a bad place where kids go when they're liars. That this was my fault because I wasn't good enough. That I deserved it." Blake closed his eyes briefly, fighting for control. When he opened them, he looked at Delia with a kind of cold rage he'd never felt before. "You're done," he said quietly. "Your life as you know it ends today." "You're overreacting," Delia said, but her voice wavered. "I was just disciplining her. My daughter turned out fine with firm discipline." "Your daughter?" Blake's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Christina?" Something flickered across Delia's face. "Fear." And Blake understood. "She knows," he said slowly. "Christina knows what you've been doing." Delia's silence was answer enough. The sound of sirens approached outside. Blake held his daughter closer, his mind already racing ahead, analyzing, planning. This wasn't just Delia. This was a conspiracy. His wife, the woman he'd loved for 12 years, the woman he'd built a life with, had allowed her mother to torture their child. The front door opened without knocking. 2 police officers entered, hands near their weapons, eyes scanning the scene. Blake carefully released Sophie and stood, hands visible. "I'm Blake Blackwell. This is my daughter, Sophie. That woman is Delia Daniels, my mother-in-law. I found her beating Sophie with that ruler." He pointed to where it lay on the floor. "Sophie has extensive bruising consistent with repeated abuse." The female officer, her name tag read Morrison, knelt beside Sophie with gentle professionalism. "Hi, sweetheart. My name is Officer Morrison. Can you show me where you're hurt?" Sophie looked at Blake first. He nodded. She pushed up both sleeves, revealing bruises on both arms. Then she lifted her shirt slightly, showing more bruises across her ribs. Officer Morrison's jaw tightened. She looked at her partner, an older man with gray at his temples. Some unspoken communication passed between them. "Ms. Daniels," the male officer said, "I'm Officer Chun. We need to ask you some questions." "I want my lawyer," Delia said immediately, her voice suddenly strong and clear. "That's your right. But I need you to stand and place your hands behind your back." "You're arresting me? For disciplining my own grandchild?" "That's not discipline," Officer Morrison said coldly, still examining Sophie's injuries. "That's assault on a minor." As Officer Chun handcuffed Delia, Blake felt Sophie's hand slip into his. He squeezed it gently, watching his mother-in-law being read her rights. This should have felt like victory, like justice. But Blake knew this was only the beginning. Because somewhere across town, Christina was going about her day, unaware that her carefully constructed facade was crumbling, unaware that her husband now knew the truth, unaware that the man she'd underestimated, the gentle therapist who talked people through their problems, was also a man who understood the human mind well enough to dismantle it piece by piece. Officer Morrison approached Blake, while her partner escorted Delia to the patrol car. "Mr. Blackwell, we'll need to take Sophie to the hospital for a full examination and to document her injuries. Child Protective Services will meet us there." "I'm coming with her." "Of course. But I need to ask, does Sophie's mother know about the abuse? Blake looked down at his daughter. Sophie's eyes met his wide and pleading. In that moment, he saw the question behind her gaze. Will you save me? Or will they make you send me back? Yes, Blake said clearly. My wife knows. I discovered evidence this morning that suggests she's been complicit in allowing her mother to abuse Sophie regularly. Officer Morrison's expression hardened further. We'll need to speak with your wife as well. Where's she now? Blake pulled out his phone. I'll find out. As he dialed Christina's number, his mind was already 3 steps ahead. This wasn't just about protecting Sophie anymore. This was about making sure that everyone who'd hurt his daughter paid the full price for their crimes. And Blake was very, very good at understanding exactly what price would break a person completely. The phone rang once, twice. On the 3rd ring, Christina answered. Blake, I'm in the middle of... Where are you? His voice was flat, emotionless. A pause. My office. Why? What's wrong? Nothing's wrong anymore, Blake said. I found Sophie. The silence that followed was answer enough. Long enough that Blake could practically hear Christina's mind racing, calculating, deciding what lie to tell. What do you mean you found her? Christina finally said, her voice carefully neutral. She's at school. No, Blake said softly. She's not. She hasn't been to school all morning. She's been at your mother's house, being beaten, like she has been every morning for God knows how long. Another pause. Then, Blake, you don't understand. The police are here. Your mother's been arrested. Sophie's on her way to the hospital. Blake kept his voice level clinical. And Christina? They're coming for you next. Don't bother running. There's nowhere you can go that I won't find you. He ended the call before she could respond. Officer Morrison had been listening. That was good, she said quietly. We'll send units to her location now. Blake nodded. He'd spent 15 years learning how to help traumatized people rebuild their shattered psyches. But those same skills, inverted, could be used to systematically destroy someone from the inside out. And Blake had all the time in the world to plan exactly how to destroy the 2 women who'd hurt his daughter. Sophie tugged on his hand. Daddy? Am I in trouble? He knelt down again, cupping her small face in his hands. No, baby. You're not in trouble. You did nothing wrong. Everything that happened to you, all of it, was their fault, not yours. Do you understand? Sophie nodded, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. I was so scared. Every day I was so scared. I know, and I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. But I see it now. And I promise you, they will never hurt you again. As they walked to the ambulance that had arrived, Blake's phone buzzed continuously with calls from Christina. He ignored them all. Let her panic. Let her feel a fraction of the fear Sophie had lived with every day. At the hospital, a specialized pediatric team examined Sophie while Blake waited in the hallway, giving statements to a detective from the Special Victims Unit. Detective Marshall Mills was in his 50s, with the weary eyes of someone who'd seen too much darkness in his career. The bruising is consistent with repeated abuse over several weeks, possibly months, Mills said, reading from notes a nurse had provided. We're also seeing evidence of psychological abuse. Sophie displays classic symptoms of learned helplessness and severe anxiety. How did this go unnoticed? Blake asked, more to himself than the detective. You'd be surprised how many cases slip through the cracks. Abusers are often careful. They hurt children in places clothing covers. They threaten them into silence. They isolate them from other adults who might notice. Mills paused. Your wife's mother, Delia Daniels, she was a school principal? 30 years. People like that understand systems. They know how to appear respectable while committing atrocities in private. And having your wife's compliance would have made it nearly impossible for Sophie to escape. Blake's hands clenched into fists. What happens now? Delia will be charged with multiple counts of child abuse, assault of a minor, and endangerment. She'll likely face significant prison time if convicted. As for your wife, Mills looked uncomfortable. Failing to protect a child from known abuse is a crime. But it's harder to prove unless we have direct evidence. She witnessed it or actively facilitated it. She knew, Blake said flatly. Sophie told me Christina threatened her too. Then we'll build a case. But Mr. Blackwell, I need to be honest with you. The legal system moves slowly. There will be hearings, evaluations, possibly a trial. This process could take months or even years. Blake nodded slowly. I understand. But Mills didn't understand. The legal system was only one arena where justice would be served. Blake had other tools at his disposal, tools the law couldn't touch. A nurse emerged from Sophie's examination room. Mr. Blackwell, Sophie's asking for you. Blake found his daughter lying in a hospital bed that seemed too large for her small frame, dressed in a hospital gown printed with cartoon characters. A child life specialist sat beside her, speaking softly. When Sophie saw Blake, she reached for him. He sat on the edge of the bed and let her curl into his side. The doctors say I need to stay here tonight, Sophie said quietly. For observation. Then I'm staying too. They said Mommy might come. Blake felt Sophie's body tense against his. Do you want to see your mother? Sophie was quiet for a long moment. When she finally spoke, her voice was small and broken. I don't know. She used to be nice. Before Grandma started doing things. Then Mommy changed. She got mean. She said I needed to learn to be tough. That Grandma was helping me. Helping you? Blake repeated hollowly. I think Mommy was scared too, Sophie whispered. Sometimes I heard them fighting. Grandma would yell at Mommy and Mommy would cry. Then Grandma would say she'd take me away if Mommy didn't do what she said. A new piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Blake had noticed Christina changing over the past year, becoming more withdrawn, more anxious, quicker to anger. He'd attributed it to stress at work. But what if Delia had been manipulating Christina too? Controlling her through threats against Sophie? It didn't excuse Christina's actions, but it complicated things. The door opened, and a woman in a CPS jacket entered. Mr. Blackwell? I'm Joyce Wheeler, the caseworker assigned to Sophie's situation. I need to speak with you about immediate custody arrangements. Blake carefully extricated himself from Sophie's grip, promising her he'd be right outside. In the hallway, Joyce got straight to business. Given the allegations against both Mrs. Blackwell and her mother, we need to ensure Sophie's safety. Do you have somewhere secure you can stay with her? Somewhere neither of them have access to. My brother has a house across town. I can call him. Good. For now, I'm recommending Sophie remain in your custody with supervised visitation only from Mrs. Blackwell, if any visitation at all, until we complete our investigation. Joyce paused. I'll be frank, Mr. Blackwell. These cases often get messy. Your wife will likely fight for joint custody. Her lawyer will argue she was also a victim of her mother's manipulation. The courts tend to favor keeping mothers involved when possible, even when the mother allowed her child to be tortured. Even then, unless we can prove deliberate malice rather than coercion, she may get a plea deal and partial custody. Blake's jaw tightened. Then I'll make sure you can prove it. Joyce studied him carefully. Mr. Blackwell, I understand you're angry, but you need to let the system work. Don't do anything that could jeopardize your custody of Sophie. I won't, Blake said truthfully. He wouldn't jeopardize his custody, but he would make absolutely certain that Christina and Delia paid for every moment of fear they'd inflicted on his daughter. His phone buzzed again. This time it was an unknown number. Blake answered. Mr. Blackwell, a smooth, professional voice. This is Cheryl Watson, attorney for Christina Blackwell. My client would like to speak with you about arranging a time to visit your daughter. No, I understand you're upset, but Mrs. Blackwell is still Sophie's mother. She has rights. She gave up those rights when she let her mother torture our child for months. Tell Christina that if she wants to see Sophie, she can explain herself in court. Mr. Blackwell, if you refuse to allow contact, we'll file for emergency custody. Try it. I dare you. Because the moment you walk into that courtroom, I'll make sure the judge sees every photograph of every bruise your client allowed to be put on my daughter's body. I'll make sure they hear Sophie testify about every time your client threatened her to keep her quiet. And I'll personally ensure that Christina's career, reputation, and freedom are destroyed so thoroughly that she'll wish she'd been the one arrested today instead of her mother. Blake ended the call and took a deep breath. Joyce was watching him with something between concern and approval. You're playing hardball, she observed. They hurt my daughter. There's no ball hard enough. Back in Sophie's room, Blake found his daughter finally sleeping, exhausted from trauma and tears. He sat beside her bed and pulled out his laptop. Time to start researching. Over the next few hours, Blake compiled everything he could find about childhood abuse cases, legal precedents, and sentencing guidelines. He made a list of everyone who would have interacted with Sophie in the past 6 months. Teachers, coaches, friends' parents. Anyone who might have noticed something was wrong. His phone rang again. This time, it was his brother, Reginald Day. "Blake, what the hell is going on? Christina just called me crying, saying you've turned the police on her." "She's right." A pause. "What?" Blake explained, his voice clinical and detached, what he'd discovered. When he finished, Reginald was silent for a long moment. "Jesus Christ," his brother finally breathed. "What do you need?" "A place to stay. Somewhere Christina doesn't know about. You can have my cabin upstate. Nobody knows about it except family." "Perfect. Can you also do some digging for me? Christina's been seeing a therapist. I need to know who and what she's been telling them." "That's privileged information, Blake. Find a way around it. Also, I need Christina's phone record for the past 6 months. And Delia's financial records. If there's money involved, I want to know about it. You're asking me to do some borderline illegal stuff here." "Reginald," Blake said quietly. "They beat my daughter. Repeatedly. For months. While I was at work trying to help other people's children recover from trauma, they were traumatizing mine. Legal doesn't matter anymore. Only justice matters." Another pause. "Then, I'll make some calls." By midnight, Blake had assembled a preliminary case file. Reginald had come through with Christina's phone records, showing dozens of calls between her and Delia on the days Sophie had complained of being sick. More damning were the text messages Reginald had somehow obtained. "Christina, she's being difficult again. Delia, I'll handle it. Drop her off before work. Christina, Blake's getting suspicious. He wants to take her to the doctor. Delia, make an excuse. We need more time. Christina, I don't know if I can keep doing this. Delia, you'll do what I say or you'll lose everything. Don't forget what I know about you." That last message made Blake pause. What did Delia know about Christina? What kind of leverage did she have? He filed that question away for later investigation and continued reading. More texts. "Christina, she's covered in bruises. What if someone sees? Delia, then you keep her home. Say she's sick. You're her mother. Act like it. Christina, this wasn't supposed to go this far. Delia, it goes as far as it needs to. She has to learn." Blake's hands shook as he read. These weren't the texts of someone being coerced. These were the texts of someone complicit. Someone who saw the bruises, heard the crying, and did nothing. He took screenshots of everything and forwarded them to Detective Mills. Then he opened a new document and began writing down everything Sophie had told him, every detail he could remember. He cross-referenced it with the medical reports, building a timeline of abuse. It was 3 a.m. when a nurse quietly entered and told him visiting hours were technically over, but given the circumstances, he could stay in the family lounge. Blake moved there reluctantly, keeping the door to Sophie's room open so he could see her. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sophie on her knees, begging. Saw the ruler raised. Saw years of mornings when he'd kissed her goodbye and unknowingly sent her into hell. His phone lit up with a new message from an unknown number. "Please, Blake, let me explain. It's not what you think. Call me. Please. Christina." Using someone else's phone because he'd blocked her. Blake's fingers hovered over the keyboard. Part of him wanted to call her, to scream, to demand answers. But another part, the therapist part that understood human psychology, knew that anything he said to her now could be used against him later. Better to stay silent. Let her panic. Let her wonder what he knew, what he was planning. Instead, he forwarded the message to Detective Mills with a note. Subject attempting to contact me. Requesting no contact order. As dawn broke over the hospital, Blake watched the sun rise through the window and thought about justice. The legal system would do its part. Arrests, trials, convictions. But legal justice wasn't enough. Not for what they'd done to Sophie. He needed to understand them completely. Their fears, their weaknesses, their pressure points. Delia's reputation was everything to her. The respected educator, the pillar of the community. Christina's career as a marketing executive depended on her image of the perfect modern woman balancing career and family. Blake knew how to destroy both. But first, he needed information. He needed to know exactly what leverage Delia had held over Christina, what had transformed his wife from the woman he'd married into someone who could enable child abuse. As Sophie woke and a nurse brought breakfast, Blake made a decision. He would use every tool at his disposal, his professional knowledge, his connections, his understanding of human psychology. He would build cases not just for the courts, but for the court of public opinion. He would systematically dismantle the lives of everyone who'd hurt his daughter, piece by piece, until they understood exactly what they'd taken from Sophie. And he would do it all while maintaining his custody, his reputation, and his standing as the wronged father seeking justice. Because Blake Blackwell hadn't spent 15 years learning to heal broken minds without also learning exactly how to break healthy ones. The real revenge was just beginning. 2 weeks later, Blake sat in his temporary office at Reginald's cabin, surrounded by file folders and legal documents. Sophie was in the next room, meeting with Dr. Elizabeth Savage, a child psychologist who specialized in trauma recovery. Soft murmurs of conversation drifted through the door. Detective Mills had called that morning with an update. Delia's arraignment had been postponed due to her lawyer claiming she'd suffered a health crisis, a convenient heart palpitation that landed her in the hospital under observation. Christina hadn't been arrested yet, pending further investigation, but a restraining order prevented her from coming within 500 feet of Sophie. Blake had also received a call from his own lawyer, Lloyd Evans, a family law specialist with a reputation for winning even the ugliest custody battles. "The texts your brother obtained are damning," Lloyd had said. But Christina's attorney is arguing coercion, that Delia manipulated her, possibly abused her in the past, and that Christina is as much a victim as Sophie. Do you believe that? Doesn't matter what I believe. Matters what we can prove. And Blake? We need to talk about how your brother obtained those text messages. If the chain of custody isn't clean, they're inadmissible. They're already in Detective Mills' hands. The police can subpoena them legally now. That's clever. Ethically questionable, but clever. Blake had learned a long time ago that ethics were a luxury reserved for people who hadn't watched their child be abused. His only ethics now were protecting Sophie and ensuring justice. The cabin door opened and Reginald entered, carrying a box of documents. "You're going to want to see this." Blake opened the box. Inside were financial records, property deeds, and what looked like personal correspondence. "Delia's house is mortgaged to the hilt," Reginald explained. "She's in debt up to her eyeballs. Medical bills from surgery last year, credit cards maxed out. And this." He pulled out a life insurance policy. "This is a policy on Sophie. $200,000. Delia is listed as the primary beneficiary." The room went cold. "When was this taken out?" Blake asked slowly. 8 months ago, right around the time the abuse started, according to Sophie's timeline. Blake's mind raced. A life insurance policy on a child with the grandmother as beneficiary. Escalating abuse that could have resulted in serious injury or death. Financial desperation. She was going to kill her, Blake said flatly. The abuse wasn't discipline or control. Delia was escalating toward murdering Sophie and collecting the insurance money. Reginald's face paled. "Jesus, we need to get this to the police." "Not yet. First, I need to know if Christina knew about the policy." "I'm already on it. Give me 2 hours." While Reginald worked, Blake checked on Sophie. Dr. Savage emerged from the session room, looking troubled. "Sophie's doing as well as can be expected," she said quietly. But Blake, she disclosed something new. She said there was another girl, a child Delia used to babysit about 5 years ago. Sophie overheard her grandmother talking about her once, saying something about how that girl learned her lesson too. Blake's blood ran cold. "You think there were other victims?" "It's possible. If Delia has a pattern of abusive behavior, Sophie may not be the first child she's hurt." "Did Sophie remember the child's name?" "No. But she said Delia has a photo album in her house, and the girl might be in it." Blake immediately called Detective Mills. "I need you to get a warrant for Delia's house. There may be evidence of prior abuse, photos, documents. And detective, you need to investigate any children Delia had contact with over the past decade. That could be hundreds of kids. She was a principal. Then start with the ones she babysat privately, and check for any suspicious injuries or deaths involving children she knew. Mills was silent for a moment. You think this goes deeper than just Sophie? I think Sophie got lucky because I found her. But there may have been children who weren't so lucky. After the call, Blake sat down with the insurance policy, studying every detail. The application had been filled out by Delia, but signed by Christina as Sophie's mother. So Christina had known. Even if she hadn't understood Delia's full intentions, she'd known about the policy. That signature might be the evidence they needed to prove Christina's active participation in a conspiracy. Reginald returned with more information. Christina's therapist is Dr. Jonathan Pitts, a psychologist who specializes in family trauma. I couldn't get his session notes. That's genuinely privileged, but I did find something interesting. Christina started seeing him 3 years ago, right after Delia moved to town. Let me guess, she was seeking help for anxiety and depression. Exactly. And the prescription records show she's been on increasingly higher doses of anti-anxiety medication. Blake leaned back in his chair, piecing it together. 3 years ago, Delia had moved nearby. Christina had immediately sought therapy and medication for anxiety. What had happened to trigger that? His phone rang. Detective Mills. We executed the warrant on Delia's house. The detective said without preamble. Blake, you were right. We found a photo album with at least a dozen children in it. Children she babysat over the years. We're working to identify them now. We also found journals. Detailed journals describing her discipline methods for multiple children going back 15 years. Blake's grip tightened on the phone. How many? At least 7 that we can identify so far. Some of them. Blake, one of them died. A 7-year-old boy named Tommy Graham. 8 years ago. Death was ruled accidental. He fell downstairs. But Delia's journal suggests otherwise. She murdered him. We're reopening the case. His parents are still alive. If we can prove Delia was responsible. Mills paused. This isn't just child abuse anymore. This is potentially multiple counts of attempted murder, assault, and possibly homicide. What about Christina? Does the journal mention her? Not by name, but there are entries from the past year that reference my daughter finally understanding the importance of proper discipline. In this, there's an entry from 8 months ago. C agreed to secure the financial future. The child must be properly managed until the time comes. The insurance policy. Christina had agreed to help Delia collect the insurance money. Whether she'd fully understood that meant Sophie's death or had been in denial, she'd been a conspirator. Blake thanked Mills and ended the call. Then he sat in the silence of his temporary office and let the full horror of it wash over him. His wife and mother-in-law hadn't just been abusing Sophie. They'd been slowly killing her, building toward a final accident that would line Delia's pockets and solve whatever twisted need Christina had to please her abusive mother. Sophie was alive only because Blake had happened to drive past at exactly the right moment on exactly the right day. The door to the therapy room opened and Sophie emerged, looking tired but calmer than she had in weeks. She walked to Blake and climbed into his lap, even though she was getting too big for it. Dr. Savage says I'm brave, Sophie said quietly. Do you think I'm brave, Daddy? Blake held her close, breathing in the scent of her shampoo. I think you're the bravest person I've ever met. She also says it's okay to be angry. At Grandma and at Mommy. She's right. Are you angry? Blake thought carefully about his answer. I'm furious, but I'm going to make sure that anger goes to the right place. I'm going to make sure you're safe and that they can never hurt you or anyone else again. Sophie was quiet for a moment. What's going to happen to Mommy? I don't know yet, baby. But whatever happens, it won't be up to us. The police and the courts will decide. That wasn't entirely true. The police and courts would handle the legal consequences, but Blake would handle the rest. Over the next week, Blake executed his plan with surgical precision. First, he contacted the parents of every child Delia had cared for over the past 15 years. Many were shocked. Some were defensive. But 3 called him back within days, asking for Detective Mills' number. They'd noticed things too: injuries, personality changes, fear around Delia. They dismissed it as accidents or childish anxiety. Now, they wanted justice for their children. Blake also reached out to the school district where Delia had been principal. Using his professional credentials, he requested copies of any incident reports filed during her tenure. What he found was damning, a pattern of harsh punishments. Children sent to her office for minor infractions coming out crying or injured, complaints from parents that had been dismissed by the school board. Delia hadn't just been abusing children at home. She'd been doing it for decades, under the protection of institutional authority. Blake compiled everything into a comprehensive dossier and delivered it not just to the police, but to local media. He gave an interview to an investigative reporter named Lori Murphy, who'd built her career on exposing abuse in positions of power. The system failed these children, Blake told her on camera, including my daughter. Delia Daniels hid behind respectability while torturing kids for years. And my wife helped her do it. The story exploded. Within 48 hours, it was national news. Delia's face was on every channel, along with photos of Sophie's bruises. Parents flooded the police with calls. The school district opened an investigation. The county prosecutor announced they were pursuing the most severe charges possible. Christina's employer placed her on indefinite leave. Her LinkedIn profile was flooded with comments calling her a monster. Her carefully curated Instagram, full of inspirational quotes and #MomLife posts, became a gallery of public outrage. Blake watched it all unfold with cold satisfaction. This was just the beginning. He'd also hired a private investigator, a woman named Robin Humphrey, to dig into Delia's past. What she uncovered explained everything. Delia had been married 3 times. Her first husband had died in an accidental house fire when Christina was 2. The insurance payout had been substantial. Her second husband had divorced her, citing emotional and physical abuse. He'd fought for custody of their son, Christina's half-brother, but lost when the boy mysteriously recanted his abuse allegations. That boy, now in his 30s, had disappeared from public records 10 years ago. I found him, Robin said during her report. He's living under a different name in Oregon, completely off the grid. I reached out. He's willing to testify about what Delia did to him as child. And the half-brother? Robin's expression darkened. Dead. Suicide at age 22. His note mentioned years of abuse and his mother making him choose between protecting his sister Christina or himself. Another piece clicked into place. Christina had witnessed Delia abuse her half-brother, had been forced to participate or stay silent. The trauma had warped her, twisted her into someone who could perpetuate the same cycle. It didn't excuse what Christina had done to Sophie, but it explained how a woman could become so broken that she'd help her abuser target her own child. Blake met with Lloyd Evans to discuss strategy. We're going to offer Christina a choice, Blake said. She testifies against Delia, takes full responsibility for her role, and agrees to supervise therapy and limited visitation with Sophie in the future. Or she fights this, and I ensure she goes to prison for conspiracy to commit murder. That's harsh. She was going to let her mother kill our daughter for insurance money. Harsh doesn't begin to cover it. Lloyd studied him. You've changed. You're colder. They broke something in me when they hurt Sophie. I'll never be the same. 2 days later, Christina's lawyer called to schedule a meeting. They met in a conference room downtown, Christina flanked by Cheryl Watson and another attorney. Christina looked terrible, gaunt, pale, dark circles under her eyes. She couldn't meet Blake's gaze. My client wishes to make a statement, Cheryl Watson said. Christina's voice was barely audible. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Blake. You have to understand, she's my mother. She's been controlling me my whole life. I didn't know how to stop her. You signed the insurance policy, Blake said flatly. You knew what it was for. I didn't. I swear I didn't know she was planning to. Christina's voice broke. I thought it was just for security. For Sophie's future. I didn't understand what she meant to do. You watched her beat our daughter and did nothing. Because she would have killed me. Don't you understand? She killed my brother. She threatened to do the same to me if I didn't help her. I was trapped. Blake leaned forward. Then prove it. Testify against her. Tell everything you know. And then accept whatever consequences come from your choices. Christina looked at her lawyer, who nodded slightly. What do you want? You plead guilty to child endangerment. You serve whatever sentence the court decides. You undergo mandatory therapy with a provider of my choosing. And you don't fight me for custody. You accept supervised visitation only, and only when Sophie is ready, which might be years from now or never. And if I agree to this, then I won't push for attempted murder charges. And I'll allow Sophie to receive letters from you, if she wants them. Christina's face crumpled. Can I see her? Just once? To tell her I'm sorry. No. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Christina began to cry, deep, wrenching sobs that shook her entire body. Blake felt nothing. Whatever love he'd once had for this woman had died the moment he'd seen Sophie on her knees. All right, Christina finally whispered. I'll do it. I'll testify against her. The next 3 months were a blur of legal proceedings. Christina testified before a grand jury, describing in detail how Delia had abused her half-brother, had controlled her through threats and violence, had manipulated her into helping with Sophie's abuse. She admitted to signing the insurance policy, but claimed she hadn't understood its true purpose until after Blake discovered the abuse. The prosecutor didn't believe her. Neither did Blake. But her testimony was enough to build an ironclad case against Delia. Delia's trial was scheduled for late spring. In the meantime, she remained in jail, denied bail due to flight risk and the severity of charges. Christina was released pending sentencing, required to wear an ankle monitor and stay away from Sophie. Blake continued his own private investigation. He connected with 6 other families whose children had been abused by Delia. Together, they formed a victim advocacy group, speaking publicly about the need for better oversight of child care providers and stronger protections for abuse victims. Sophie began to heal. Slowly, painfully but steadily. Dr. Savage worked with her 3 times a week. Blake enrolled her in a new school where nobody knew about her past. He read her stories every night, checked under her bed for monsters, promised her repeatedly that she was safe. Some nights she had nightmares. Blake would hold her while she cried, whispering promises of protection until she fell back asleep. But some mornings Sophie laughed. She made friends. She drew pictures that didn't include violence or fear. Small victories, but victories nonetheless. Blake's practice had to be put on hold, but his colleagues understood. He'd become something of a public figure. The father who'd saved his daughter and exposed a monster. Other abuse survivors reached out to him, sharing their own stories, thanking him for speaking up. He published an essay about recognizing signs of child abuse, about trusting instincts, about the importance of believing children. It went viral. He was invited to speak at conferences, to consult with law enforcement on child abuse cases. Blake had always wanted to make a difference in the world. Now he was just not in the way he'd imagined. Reginald called one evening with unexpected news. The prosecutor just added new charges against Delia. They're reopening the Tommy Graham case, the 7-year-old who died. They're charging her with first-degree murder. Do they have enough evidence? Her journal entries are pretty damning. She wrote about how troublesome Tommy was, how she needed to correct him permanently. And the coroner is reviewing the autopsy. The injuries were consistent with being pushed, not a simple fall. Blake absorbed this. If convicted of murder, Delia would die in prison. Justice in its purest form. There's something else, Reginald said. Christina's half-brother, the one in Oregon, he's agreed to testify. He's going to tell the court how Delia abused him and his brother for years. How she drove his brother to suicide. It's going to be devastating testimony. Blake allowed himself a small smile. The trap was closing perfectly. Delia's trial began on a Tuesday morning in late April. Blake attended every day, sitting in the front row so Delia could see him. He wanted her to know that he was there, watching, ensuring she paid for every crime. Sophie didn't attend. Blake wouldn't put her through that. But he took notes every day, planning to tell her everything when she was older and ready to know. The prosecution built their case methodically. Medical experts testified about Sophie's injuries. Teachers described changes in her behavior. Dr. Savage explained the psychological trauma Sophie had endured. Detective Mills walked the jury through Delia's journals, reading passages that made people gasp in horror. Then Christina took the stand. She looked small and broken as she described her childhood, her mother's abuse, her brother's death. She admitted to enabling the abuse of Sophie, claimed she'd been too afraid and traumatized to stop it. "I failed my daughter," Christina said, tears streaming down her face. "I let my fear of my mother override my duty to protect my child. Nothing can excuse that. Nothing can make it right. I will carry that guilt for the rest of my life." Blake watched dispassionately. The jury might buy the narrative of Christina as a victim turned enabler, or they might see her as simply an accomplice. Either way, she'd already agreed to plead guilty. Her fate was sealed. Delia's defense tried to paint her as a strict disciplinarian who'd been misunderstood. They argued that her journals were therapeutic exaggerations, that the abuse allegations were overstated, that she'd never intended harm. But then Robin Humphrey took the stand. She presented evidence of Delia's 3 marriages, the suspicious death of her first husband, the abuse allegations in her second marriage. She described the pattern of control and violence spanning decades. And then Christina's half-brother testified. His name was Mark Lloyd, and he was 34 years old. He hadn't spoken to his mother in over a decade. As he described the years of beatings, starvation, and psychological torture, several jurors wept. "She told me I was worthless," Mark said quietly, "that I deserved the punishment, that if I told anyone, she'd kill my little brother. So I stayed silent. I took the beatings, and when I couldn't take it anymore, I recanted my abuse claims during the custody battle because she threatened to make my brother disappear if I didn't." "And your brother?" the prosecutor asked gently. "He killed himself at 22. His suicide note said he couldn't live with what he'd seen our mother do, with what he'd been forced to do to survive her. She destroyed him." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of Mark's quiet crying. Delia sat at the defense table, her face a mask of fury. She'd aged 20 years in the past few months, her skin sallow, her hair gray and thin. Prison had not been kind to the former school principal. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Blake attended every single day, a silent sentinel of justice. Finally, closing arguments. The prosecutor stood before the jury and said simply, "Delia Daniels is a predator who used her authority and respectability to torture children for decades. She beat them. She starved them. She destroyed their spirits. And she murdered at least one child, maybe more. The evidence is overwhelming. The testimony is credible. Justice demands that you find her guilty on all counts." The defense attorney argued that Delia was a flawed woman who'd made mistakes but wasn't a murderer. That Christina was an unreliable witness. That the journals were fantasy, not confession. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, Blake held his breath. On the charge of first-degree murder of Tommy Graham, guilty. On the charge of attempted murder of Sophie Blackwell, guilty. On multiple counts of child abuse, guilty. The verdict continued, guilty after guilty after guilty. By the end, Delia had been convicted of 19 separate charges. She showed no emotion as the verdicts were read. But when the judge announced sentencing would be in 2 weeks, she finally looked at Blake. Their eyes met across the courtroom. Blake saw rage there, and hate, and finally, for just a moment, fear. He smiled. Sentencing day arrived with the weight of finality. The courtroom was packed with victims and their families, reporters, and advocates. Blake sat in his usual spot, with Sophie's empty chair beside him, symbolizing her absence and the childhood that had been stolen. The judge, a stern woman named Violet Leach who presided over countless criminal cases, looked at Delia with open contempt. "Mrs. Daniels, in my 30 years on the bench, I have never encountered a defendant whose crimes were so systematic, so calculated, and so devoid of remorse. You used your position as an educator and caregiver to torture children. You murdered a 7-year-old boy. You attempted to murder your own granddaughter for financial gain." Delia stood silent, her lawyer beside her. "The law provides me with guidelines for sentencing," Judge Leach continued. "But in this case, I am not bound by minimums. I am authorized to impose the maximum penalty allowed under law." The judge looked at the packed courtroom, then back at Delia. "For the first-degree murder of Tommy Graham, life imprisonment without possibility of parole. For the attempted murder of Sophie Blackwell, 25 years to run consecutively. For the multiple counts of child abuse, 15 years on each count to run consecutively. Blake did the math quickly. Even if the sentences partially overlapped, Delia would die in prison. She was 63 years old. She'd never breathe free air again. Additionally, Judge Leach said, "I am recommending you be held in maximum security with limited visitation rights and no early release considerations." The state of Connecticut does not execute its prisoners, Mrs. Daniels, but rest assured, you will never leave prison alive. Delia's lawyers started to object, but Delia put a hand on his arm. For the first time since her arrest, she spoke. "I regret nothing," she said clearly. "Those children needed discipline. My granddaughter needed correction. If you all weren't so weak, so permissive, you'd understand that." The courtroom erupted. Judge Leach's gavel cracked like thunder. "Remove the defendant. We're done here." As guards escorted Delia out in chains, she looked one last time at Blake. This time, he saw no fear, only defiance. Blake felt a strange emptiness. He'd expected triumph. But watching Delia disappear through the doors, he felt only tired. Christina's sentencing came 2 weeks later in a different courtroom. She'd pleaded guilty to child endangerment, conspiracy to commit insurance fraud, and failure to report child abuse. The prosecutor recommended 12 years in prison. Christina's lawyer argued for 5 years with work release, citing her own history of abuse and her cooperation with the investigation. Blake was called to make a victim impact statement. He stood before the court and looked at Christina, really looked at her for the first time in months. She was crying silently, her hands shaking in her lap. Sophie asks about her mother sometimes. Blake said quietly, "She wants to know if you ever loved her. If any of it was real, the bedtime stories, the birthday parties, the times you told her she was special." Christina's shoulders shook with sobs. "I tell her that you must have loved her once. Before your mother's poison took root. Before fear and trauma twisted you into someone unrecognizable. I tell her that the mother she remembers from when she was little was real, even if that woman doesn't exist anymore." Blake paused, collecting himself. "But I also tell her the truth. That love without protection is meaningless. That you knew she was being hurt and you did nothing. That you chose your own survival over hers." He looked at the judge. "Christina Blackwell needs prison time. She needs consequences. But she also needs treatment, intensive, long-term therapy to address the trauma that made her into someone who could enable child abuse. I don't want revenge against her. I want her to understand what she did, to truly grasp the magnitude of her failure, and to spend the rest of her life trying to become someone worthy of asking for Sophie's forgiveness someday. Even if I never grant it," Blake finished. "Even if Sophie never grants it, Christina needs to try." The judge sentenced Christina to 8 years in prison with mandatory therapy, followed by 5 years of supervised probation. She could potentially have contact with Sophie in the future, but only if Sophie wanted it and if multiple therapists agreed it wouldn't be harmful. Christina was led away in handcuffs, still crying. She tried to say something to Blake as she passed, but he turned away. Life settled into a new normal over the following months. Sophie continued therapy and seemed to grow stronger each week. She made friends at her new school, joined the art club, started taking karate lessons. The nightmares came less frequently. Blake reopened his practice, though he now specialized exclusively in child abuse recovery. His waiting list was months long. He also worked with law enforcement, training officers to recognize signs of abuse and helping develop better protocols for interviewing child victims. The cabin became their permanent home. Blake sold the house he'd shared with Christina. He couldn't imagine living there again, knowing what had happened. Sophie seemed relieved to leave it behind. One evening, as Blake was making dinner, Sophie appeared in the kitchen doorway. "Daddy? Dr. Savage says I should talk to you about something." Blake set down the knife and gave her his full attention. "What is it, sweetheart?" "I've been thinking about Mommy. About what she did." Sophie's voice was steady, more mature than her 8 years should allow. "Dr. Savage helped me understand that Mommy was hurt by Grandma too, when she was little. that sometimes hurt people hurt other people. That's true. But she also said that being hurt doesn't make it okay to hurt someone else. That mommy still chose wrong. That's also true. Sophie was quiet for a moment. I don't think I want to see mommy. Not for a long time. Maybe never. Is that okay? Blake knelt down to her level. Sophie, that choice is entirely yours. Nobody, not me, not the courts, not anyone, can force you to have a relationship with your mother if you don't want one. You get to decide what's best for you. But what if she gets sad? What if she needs me? Blake took her hands gently. Your job is not to make your mother feel better. Your job is to be a kid, to heal, to grow up happy and strong. Your mother's feelings are her responsibility, not yours. Sophie nodded slowly. Dr. Savage said something like that too. She said I have to put on my own oxygen mask first. She's exactly right. Okay. Sophie smiled, a real smile that reached her eyes. I'm going to focus on my own oxygen mask then. Maybe someday I'll be ready to share air with mommy again. But not now. And that's perfectly okay. As Blake returned to making dinner, he felt a weight lift. Sophie was going to be okay. She was resilient, smart, capable of processing her trauma in healthy ways. She would carry scars, yes, but they wouldn't define her. Later that night, after Sophie was asleep, Blake sat on the porch with a glass of whiskey and looked at the stars. His phone buzzed with a message from Detective Mills. Delia was attacked in prison today. She's in the infirmary. Looks like some of the other inmates found out what she did to kids. Prison justice. Blake read the message and felt nothing. No satisfaction, no sympathy, nothing. Delia's fate was sealed either way. She'd die behind bars, whether from old age, prison violence, or her own misery. Another message came through, this one from Lloyd Evans. Christina's lawyer filed an appeal for a reduced sentence. Unlikely to succeed, but thought you should know. Blake deleted the message. Christina's legal battles were no longer his concern. She'd made her choices. Now she'd live with the consequences. A third message from Mark Lloyd, Christina's half-brother. Thank you for letting me be part of bringing her down. For the first time in 20 years, I slept through the night without nightmares. Justice doesn't erase the past, but it helps. Blake smiled slightly and typed back, "You're welcome. Take care of yourself." The night air was cool and clean. Somewhere inside the cabin, Sophie slept peacefully, protected and loved. Blake had given up his old life, his marriage, his illusions about the world. But he'd gained something more important. His daughter's safety and the knowledge that he'd fought for her when it mattered most. The legal system had done its part. Delia would die in prison. Christina would serve significant time. Other victims had come forward, finding their voices, beginning their own healing journeys. But Blake's real revenge wasn't the prison sentences or the destroyed reputations. It was this: Sophie laughing over breakfast. Sophie making art without fear. Sophie growing up knowing that when she needed someone to fight for her, her father had fought with everything he had. That was the revenge that mattered. Not destruction, but restoration. Not punishment, but protection. Blake finished his whiskey and went inside. He checked on Sophie one last time, kissed her forehead, and whispered the same thing he said every night. "You're safe now. I promise. Forever." And for the first time since this nightmare began, Blake truly believed it. 3 years passed. Sophie was 11 now, thriving in middle school. She'd grown 4 inches, her blonde hair cut short at her request because it was easier for karate. She'd earned her blue belt and competed in local tournaments. Her art hung throughout the cabin, bright, colorful pieces that showed a child who'd moved through darkness into light. Blake had expanded his practice and published a book about childhood trauma recovery. He traveled for speaking engagements, always bringing Sophie along so they wouldn't be separated. She'd become something of a minor celebrity herself, the brave girl who'd survived and thrived. They rarely spoke about Delia or Christina anymore. The past was healing over, scar tissue forming where there had once been open wounds. Then, one Tuesday afternoon, Blake received a letter forwarded from his publisher. The return address was a women's correctional facility in Connecticut. He almost threw it away without opening it, but something made him slice open the envelope. The letter was from Christina. "Blake, I know I have no right to contact you. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but my therapist says writing this is part of my recovery, even if you never read it. I've spent 3 years in prison thinking about what I did, about the woman I became. My therapist here helped me understand that being abused by my mother doesn't excuse my choice to enable Sophie's abuse. I was a victim once, but then I became a perpetrator. That's on me. I think about Sophie every day. I wonder if she's happy, if she's healing, if she ever thinks about me. I hope she doesn't actually. I hope she's moved on completely and built a life that doesn't include the pain I caused. I don't expect forgiveness. I don't deserve it. But I want you to know that I understand now, really understand what I did. The horror of it. The betrayal. I failed Sophie in the worst way a mother can fail a child. My mother wrote me a letter last year. She's dying, liver cancer. She wanted me to visit her. I refused. For the first time in my life, I told her no. I told her she destroyed everything she touched, including me, and that I wanted nothing to do with her ever again. She screamed at me through the phone, called me ungrateful, weak, stupid, all the things she called me growing up. But this time I hung up, and I felt free. For the first time in 40 years, free. I'll be eligible for parole in 3 more years. If I get out, I'm moving away, somewhere far from Connecticut, far from the past. I'll start over with a new name if the court allows it. I'll spend the rest of my life trying to become someone better. I don't expect to ever see Sophie again. But if someday, years from now, she wants to meet me, wants to tell me face to face how much I hurt her, I'll be there. I'll listen, and I'll accept whatever she needs to say. Tell her I'm sorry. Tell her I loved her, even though I failed to show it when it mattered. Tell her she deserves every happiness in the world. Christina. Blake read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and put it in a file folder in his office safe. Sophie didn't need to see it now. Maybe someday, when she was older and if she asked about her mother, Blake would give it to her. Or maybe he wouldn't. That would be Sophie's choice too. That evening, as Blake and Sophie prepared dinner together, a Tuesday night tradition, Sophie asked suddenly, "Do you ever think about Mommy?" Blake considered his answer carefully. "Sometimes." "Do you?" "Not really. Sometimes I remember things from before, like when she used to read me stories or when we went to the beach that one summer. Good things. Those memories are real. You can keep them if you want, but they're mixed up with bad stuff too. It's confusing. That's normal. People are complicated. Your mother did terrible things, but she also probably did love you in her own broken way." Sophie stirred the pasta sauce thoughtfully. "Dr. Savage says that I can love the person my mother used to be and still not want her in my life now. That both things can be true. Dr. Savage is right." "Okay." Sophie nodded decisively. "Then that's what I choose. I'll remember the good parts sometimes, but I don't want to see her. Not now. Maybe not ever." "That's completely fair." They finished making dinner in comfortable silence. Later, after Sophie went to bed, Blake received an email from Detective Mills. The subject line read, "Thought you should know. Blake, Delia Daniels died this morning. Liver cancer, same as what's killing her in spirit before it killed her body. She never expressed remorse, never accepted responsibility. She died angry and alone. The warden said she ranted until the end about how everyone had betrayed her, how she'd done nothing wrong. Her last words were apparently cursing your name. Thought you'd want to know it's finally over. Mills." Blake read the email and felt the last piece of the puzzle click into place. It was over. Delia was gone. Christina was locked away, trying to become a better person. Sophie was healing. Justice had been served. Legal justice through the courts, social justice through public exposure, and cosmic justice through a painful death. But Blake knew the real justice was happening every day in the cabin. Sophie laughing. Sophie thriving. Sophie safe. That night, Blake slept through without waking once. The next morning at breakfast, Blake told Sophie that her grandmother had died. Sophie was quiet for a long moment. Then she asked, "Am I supposed to feel sad?" "You're supposed to feel however you feel. There's no right or wrong emotion here. I don't feel sad. I feel relieved." "Is that bad?" "No, sweetheart. That's completely normal." "Will there be a funeral?" "Probably. But we don't have to go if you don't want to." Sophie thought about it. "I don't want to go. I want to remember her being gone, not see her one more time. Then we won't go." And they didn't. Instead, that Saturday, Blake and Sophie went to the beach. The same beach Christina had taken Sophie to years ago when things were good. They built sandcastles and collected shells and ate ice cream until their stomachs hurt. As the sun set over the water, Sophie leaned against Blake and said, "Thank you for saving me, Daddy. You saved yourself, Sophie. You survived. You found the strength to tell me what was happening. I just helped finish the job. We make a good team. The best team." Sophie smiled, and in that moment, Blake knew that everything he'd done, the investigation, the legal battles, the systematic destruction of his enemies, had been worth it. Not for revenge, but for this. For his daughter's smile. For her safety. For her future. Sometimes justice means prison sentences and public disgrace. Sometimes it means watching your enemies suffer as they deserve. But sometimes the sweetest justice is simply surviving, thriving, and building a life so full of love and joy that the people who tried to destroy you become irrelevant. Blake had achieved all three kinds of justice. And as he sat on that beach with his daughter, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink, he finally felt at peace. The war was over. They had won. And Sophie, brave, resilient, incredible Sophie, would grow up knowing that when evil tried to break her, she'd been strong enough to survive it. And when she couldn't fight for herself, someone who loved her had fought for her with everything he had. That was the legacy Blake wanted to leave. Not one of revenge, but one of protection. Not one of hatred, but one of healing. As they drove home that night, Sophie fell asleep in the passenger seat, her hand still clutching a perfect seashell she'd found buried in the sand. Blake glanced at her peaceful face and thought about how close he'd come to losing her. How one moment of intuition, the decision to drive past his mother-in-law's house on that Tuesday morning, had changed everything. He'd been trained to read people, to spot hidden trauma. But he'd almost missed the most important case of his life. Never again. Blake had spent years helping others heal from trauma. Now he'd ensured his own daughter could heal too. And in the process, he'd learned something profound. That the strongest revenge isn't destroying your enemies, but ensuring they can never hurt anyone again while building something beautiful from the ruins they left behind. Sophie stirred in her sleep, mumbling something about sandcastles. Blake smiled and drove toward home, toward their future, toward the life they'd fought so hard to protect. Behind them, the past receded like the tide, still present in the erosion marks it left, but no longer powerful enough to pull them under. They were free. Finally, completely, eternally free. And that was the only revenge Blake had ever really needed. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.